each variety we've kind of come to learn has its own personality, just as it is. And then we also have the joy of that kind of changing every year based on harvest year, pre-harvest conditions, the grain quality once it's in the malt house. And so we're always kind of tweaking. I don't think there's ever a batch here that is like pure autopilot. We're always checking certain parameters to make sure we're on track, or adjusting things because we wanted to pull a lever based on the batch prior. So that's what's actually the most fun to me, and it's kind of linking back to the agriculture, which is what drove me here, is how dynamic agriculture is, but then the small grains that it produces. I mean, it's trying to, we're just getting grain quality reports in from the 2023 harvest, and it is like my favorite time of year, other than the fact that we're also simultaneously trying to set seed contracts for the fall, so it's also very manic. But every time you get one of these reports, you can put like kind of like a face to these grains and learn what it went through during the growing season, but then pre-harvest conditions, and whether it got a little bit too much rain before harvest and so forth. So it's every report you're kind of like, ooh, what did we get? We just got some test results from the Northern Neck. So it's really great protein. It's like 9.6, 9.7, which is about as good as you can ask for. And it's really high test weight. So we know that the lower protein and the higher test weight will make it a perfect base malt. It will be high extract because of the low protein, but also because of the test weight. So they're big, fat, plump kernels, so they have a lot of starch in them. And so somewhat like a vintner would say, oh, we have high sugar content, I would say I have high starch content, which will produce more sugar in the brew house. Slightly higher protein actually produces really great color in malt. So if we have grains that are 12, 13, maybe even 14% protein, we can allot those to our higher kilned, higher color malts like Munich's. We have a kiln roasted hybrid caramel, which is like a crystal melanoidin malt hybrid. And we have two versions of that. So those kinds of grains are great for those high color, high flavor malts, whereas lower protein, you're really looking for like ideal extract. So every year in May, Virginia Tech invites grain growers, buyers, whoever is interested in small grains out to the Eastern AREC, which is the Agricultural Research Extension program that they have. They have, I think, 7 throughout the state. So they can essentially plant the same varieties, not necessarily at every single place, but you can see how a particular variety would do in Warsaw or Blacksburg or Orange County or Orange, Virginia, so kind of up 15. And so you can kind of see how microclimates have an effect on stuff, but the major field days out in Warsaw. And so you are essentially intermingled with breeders and growers and end users. And so that's how I went about building my grower network. I mean, that was actually the first thing I did. If I don't have any grain, how I malt it makes no difference. And so, it took a good year and a half before I even opened this place to make sure that I had the growers on hand with the acreage available to make my first contract. So like that was my first jumping off point of like, okay, well, the parachute is off. When you say in October, it's like, okay, Dan, go ahead and plant, 30 acres or 20 acres of something. Come June, you better have a place to put it And so very much the focus early on was making sure the ag side was covered. And that's always the case every year. Barley, wheat, hopefully rye soon. Oats, corn, spelt, 6-row barley, believe. So we just essentially saved from extinction this white wheat, this soft white wheat that was bred in Virginia. It was bred by Virginia Tech. We are a red wheat state. So white wheat is very susceptible to sprout damage. So it has no dormancy. So if it rains too much in the spring, which it always does, it can sprout in the field, and that makes it non-malt quality. But we found a good white wheat here, and brewers are used to white wheat. That's what they grow out west, and so since all the malt comes from out west, they all have white wheat. And so we wanted to bring in something that brewers recognized and were used to using. And it ended up being that they love red wheat just as much, but I think it was more principle for us. It's a great like microcosm of seed breeding and like seed availability and variety availability. So Tech went through 10 years of breeding this wheat, and then the millers were like, no, we're good. And so they sold the rights to the white wheat variety to Michigan Crop Improvement. So we no longer really had access to it here. I found it in their kind of their library. I got some seed from Michigan Crop Improvement, but that was the last certified seed I could get because they were also like moving on to the next varieties. And so if these varieties don't get picked up or loved by somebody, they will just cease to exist. And that's why these breeding programs are big because they're crossing like tens of thousands of parents to find these traits that are wanted. But if, Purdue or, Manel Milling or Ardent Mills or like these big corporations that need these grains for feed or milling, if they don't want it, for all intents and purposes, no one gets to have it. And so we had to do it ourselves. So we brought seed down. We had it grown at Grapewood Farm just to increase the seed amount, see how it grew here, which obviously it like loves growing in Virginia because it was bred to grow here. And then we took some of that seed and we sent it to Virginia Crop Improvement, and they grew us out 5 acres of certified seed. And then now we have totes of certified seed of Venus soft white wheat that we've kind of like brought back to life. And so we use that as our white wheat variety. So it's more, I think it's probably more of like a pride thing on my behalf, but I think that's what needs to be done. I mean, we are now, sorry if I go soapboxing here, because I'm totally going to go soapboxing. So right now we're having this like resurgence of a desire to find heritage varieties. So like we've been operating for decades and decades and decades of going like, what's the best yield? What requires the least inputs, or what has what's Roundup ready so we can round it up and it won't kill the crop, but it'll kill everything around it. What's the best thing for bushels per acre or test weight, or all of these things that breeding programs are developing. But oftentimes what a lot of stuff is lost in that is the stuff that people actually want, which is typically flavor. And so a lot of these heavily bred varieties, flavors like don't worry about flavor, like what's the agronomics of it. What I'm hoping for the most in the malting side of the world is that we can get a Virginia bred variety, somewhat like Avalon. And Avalon's going kind of through this test right now, which is the first Virginia bred 2-row malting barley we've ever had. which is a feat in and of itself. And the fact that it's happening when I'm owning a malt house is wild, but that has a heritage flavor to it. So like the UK celebrates, they get a lot of traction with their barley because they have Maris Otter, they have Barca, they have Golden Promise. These are all varieties that taste totally distinct and totally awesome by themselves. It's not kiln influenced. So I have an English pale, which is meant to essentially be an ale malt that exudes the same flavor vibes as Maris Otter and Golden Promise and Barca. And, well, Barca's German, but I produce the flavor on the kiln. That flavor, the Maris Otter and Golden Promise, that's derived from the grain itself, and they kiln it a lot like I kiln just our standard pale malt, but it hits different because it's got this particular varietal flavor. So I'm kind of hoping we can find one that has kick-ass flavor, but I think it's going to be in a heritage variety and not in bred varieties. So like I think we got to look back to find it instead of looking forward. I would say, like, as of right now, I would think corn has a deeper story now that particularly distillers can take advantage of, and we're trying to celebrate it now. We have a corn malt line that rotates. So I always change the variety to like a different Virginia heirloom or heritage variety, to kind of spotlight this stuff. Like I don't want just like non-GMO yellow den corn. Like the corn we have now, it's called Buena Vista. It was hand selected by the grower from a landrace variety. So it's from here, but it's seed selected for milling quality and test weight and so kernel size and yield. But it's got roots on a Virginia landrace variety. So it's still, that's a heritage corn. It's just hand selected and then seed stocked. When you start with a raw kernel of grain, right, that's essentially the endosperm is 75% of that kernel. That's essentially the portable food source for the embryo to grow a new plant. So you plant it 1.5 inches in the ground, it's got to feed the embryo until it reaches sunlight, right? So that 75% starch, that kernel releases enzymes when it's watered, it gets rained on underground, it starts to increase in moisture, and it starts to release enzymes meant to break that endosperm down into sugars for the embryo to consume until it reaches sunlight, obviously, which then photosynthesis takes over. So that's the reason why enzymes are being created in the first place. But if you picture that endosperm, if you picture concrete with a bunch of marbles in it, the marbles are the actual starch granules, but it's surrounded by all this concrete or noise known as, beta-glucan, arabinoxylan, protein, all of these things that are essentially protecting the starch granule. So there's multiple enzymes that are released by the kernel to break all that concrete down, but then they also have to break through the outside wall of the marble, like the starch granule cell wall. So you have enzymes that do that. And so not until all the concrete's removed and there's holes in the marble can that starch actually be converted to sugar. And so that's all we're doing here is breaking down all of the concrete and exposing the marble. We don't want to actually convert the starch to sugar. We would not have extract to give to, we would not have a product to give to a brewer. That's what they're doing. We're essentially we're coaxing all the enzymes out of the system, getting them to break all the concrete down, and then freezing them in space. And that's what the kilning does. If we were to leave it in germination, those enzymes would start to convert all of that starch to sugar, and you'd get a new plant, which there's plentiful versions of a small sprouted grain in here. If you were to press that kernel between your fingers, there'd be nothing inside of it. It would just be this like shell of its former self. And so that's where, now that we've broken down all that concrete, that's what makes it friable or like crushable, so that you can chew it, and it's you know, you can mill it into a flour form, as opposed to these really hard, kind of like steely, starchy granules, which are very hard for enzymes to get through to get to the actual starch granules. So we're just doing all of the work to prepare this from a otherwise like unusable ingredient for all intents and purposes into something that's extractable, that is an extractable starch source. It's the storytelling in grain that I think gets people latched on to the grain side of brewing. And so that's why I think, you know, there's this move back to lager brewing, farmhouse brewing. You know, you have Wheatland Spring in Waterford, Virginia, making like literal land beer. I mean, land beer is not a style; it's a way of life. It's a way of doing things. You grow what you grow on your property, and you harvest it, and you make beer out of it. Like that. That is land beer, and it's some of the most sought after beer in the country, right? So it's there's just this big change of thinking, and I kind of think us small folk are the ones that need to kind of tell the stories to get these people excited.